Well, it's great to be with you, Amy.
I
Um,
love it. Yes.
yeah, we're in the sidelines here in Davos.
Yeah.
Let's just start for our audience because a lot of people at Devex know you. I
Mm.
mean, you ran against your boss and won your current job. That's kind of a unique thing. Uh, but what's your backstory? Because I was looking a little bit at your history. You're not new to migration.
No.
You worked in the Biden administration, you worked in the Obama administration
Yeah.
on migration issues. Like, what got you into this line of work, if you want to call it that, to begin with?
So I actually started as a prosecutor. And the reason I chose law was, frankly, I grew up in a Jewish community. My dad is an evangelical Christian. We moved into this Jewish community. He really wanted to kind of spread the gospel.
This sounds like a Netflix
I know,
series that's
it's
waiting to be
crazy.
written.
I lived in the church. We had so we had a lot of different people coming in and out of our house all the time. Often people who had migrated, often people who are down on their luck, just looking for somebody to listen to them. And my next door neighbor was a survivor of the Holocaust.
Wow.
And so as a very young kid, I became aware of a couple things. One is openness to being different and doing hard things and having sort of people down on their luck come in and be part of our life, but also the injustice of what had happened to the community in which I had lived. And so I thought, well, what would I do if I were a kid growing up at that moment in time, and how would I have reacted? And for me, that became, how do I use the law, right?
Hmm.
For me, that was the space I felt most comfortable. So I became a prosecutor. I worked at the Justice Department. I worked in the Civil Rights Division. I was working all over the country prosecuting hate crimes and trafficking cases. And what became really clear to me is that the community that was most at risk, and there's a long history of racial injustice in our country,
Sure.
but more than that was migrants.
Hmm.
And you were seeing people being exploited in the workplace, you were seeing people being vilified, you were seeing people being chased out of communities. And for me, that was the issue of our moment. That was the issue that I felt called to work on. And so I worked um, in the Senate for a while. I worked on the immigration reform bill that President Bush put forward. I worked on migration issues at the Justice Department. I worked on cross-border trafficking and human smuggling issues for the Justice Department. And when the White House decided it wanted to prioritize the work in Mexico on human smuggling, human trafficking, they asked if I would come up and start working on that issue there.
Hmm.
So that's the
Is it
backstory. It's a
is
long,
it
long backstory.
no, but it's amazing how your career has tracked an issue. It's been around forever, but it's become a bigger and bigger and bigger
Yes.
issue, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I mean, you tell me if I'm right, but it seems like on almost every measure, migration has become a bigger challenge, right?
Yeah.
Like more people are moving, more people are feeling forced to move. There's more human trafficking. And does that all ring true from your perspective?
Absolutely. You look at what happened at the US Mexico border just the last couple of years, where we saw numbers that had never been seen before. And more importantly, we saw nationalities coming across to the border. I mean, over 100 different nationalities came up to the US
Yeah, how do
border.
you assess that? Why do you think so many people from far away, not just Central America, not just Mexico, showed up
Right.
there?
There are a couple of reasons. Number one is that the situation on the ground for people around the world has become more and more desperate. And people are lacking opportunity at home. In some cases, they're fleeing violence, but more often they're fleeing lack of opportunity and poverty, right? They just don't have options at home to feed their family, to get ahead. So you have that playing out, and that got much, much worse with COVID and the inflationary shocks and the economic recessions experienced all over the world. So people in the past who had found job opportunities in a neighboring country no longer could do it. At the same time, you saw a need for jobs, particularly in the service sector and construction and agriculture in places like the United States. And so people were migrating up through an irregular channel, getting into the country and then getting a job. And then they'd pass that information back through all of their networks. The smugglers and the traffickers, of course, profit off of that. They
Sure.
find all sorts of easy ways for people to move. And so it became sort of a circular pattern operating entirely out of traditional legal frameworks. And in the meantime, if you're a farmer in the United States and you run a big agribusiness, or if you are in the construction industry, you need a workforce, and you're not finding that workforce necessarily in people who are citizens. And so it became an easy way to fill their own labor market needs because they didn't have the visas available. So you see this dynamic play out where the incentives to migrate irregularly became higher and higher and higher.
So now, if you see, obviously in the U.S., we're talking on the day of Trump's inauguration.
Right.
If he does decide to do some of what he's talked about, some kind of a mass deportation, what's that going to mean for the U.S. economy? If you're right that all of these people have come in, or a large proportion have been absorbed into really vital industries, what do you think? What do you expect could play out?
So I found it really, it resonated quite a lot when some of the recent economic reports showed that the United States had the fastest post-COVID economic recovery, and one of the factors is migration,
Yeah.
right? So it is clear that American industry has been relying on migrants, high skilled, low skilled, irregular, regular, across the board. So if you start to pull out that workforce, if you do not have another workforce ready to go in, you're going to see the impact across the board. So where you see irregular migrants working tends to be the lower skilled, right? Agriculture, construction, manufacturing, things like meat processing, right? Jobs that many Americans are not interested in taking. You'll start to see those industries being affected, and I suspect that we'll start to hear complaints from the owners of those businesses, right? And you'll start to see a slowdown in terms of meat processing, in terms of agriculture, in terms of a number of other sectors where migrants are now working completely under the radar.
And I know you've written about and talked about, it sounds like what you're looking for is for countries, not just the US, but a lot of rich world countries, to have a better path for regular migration, exactly for jobs like that are needed.
Yeah, because irregular migration is not good for anybody. I mean, first and foremost, it undermines confidence in government, because if the government cannot manage its border, and if there's a perception that everybody can come up to the border and cross, and you don't have to wait in a line, and you don't have to submit your documents, it undermines public confidence. And we saw that in the United States, and we see it all over the world. And by the way, in rich countries and in poor countries.
Yeah. But you can really see it driving in poor countries too, but especially in rich countries, driving politics now.
Absolutely. Right? It undermines trust. That's number one. But number two, it creates a system where the people manipulating the system are smugglers and traffickers. They're people operating completely outside the law. So you lose your ability to regulate who's coming in and why they're coming in, and do they have the proper documents, and do they have the skills, et cetera, et cetera. And then those who are employing them, they're operating outside of the system. So they are relying on a workforce, not necessarily knowing who they are, not necessarily paying them what they should pay them. And then that drives down wages, and that creates more problems within communities. So I do believe very, very strongly in the importance of regular migration. I know there are lots of stakeholders who have different points of view on how to do that, but unless countries get their arms around a migration policy that meets their workforce needs, they're going to keep dealing with these irregular movements.
And it sounds like it's a combination. You kind of have to be tougher on the border to crack down on the irregular.
Right.
But at the same time, you need a pathway. Otherwise, you hurt the industries, right?
Yeah.
But what do you do with the people already there? I mean, the U.S. is a good example, right, where there's this idea of mass deportation that could lead to families that have been around a long time.
The idea has been in play for the last 20 years, right? But there are ways of saying, okay, if you've been living in a country, if you have been holding down a job, paying your taxes, not committing crimes, kids are in school, whatever, you can create whatever factors you want. You offer people a way to regularize their status, right? You can slice it and dice it in all sorts of ways to meet whatever workforce or social needs that might exist. But when you're in the United States and you're talking over 11 million people who've been living and working there, frankly, and I know this because I worked at a time when more than 400,000 people were removed in a year under President Obama. The system cannot bear removing 11 million people. The logistical capacity does not exist. The cost, the money, the what you need to make that system work is not available. So given that, there needs to be a way so that you can get a sense of who's in the country, what are they doing, let's give them status, make sure they're paid fairly, make sure that their entry into the workforce is being done in a regular way.
Yeah, it's a very hard thing to do, and it's hard to know whether President Trump, we can call him that in a few hours, I think, President Trump's rhetoric on this is in part to scare migrants who would consider coming
Yeah.
and keep them out, and how much of it is a reality of, no, we're going to try to round up actually millions of people, which you're right, logistically, it sounds like what would be needed to do it, the number of law enforcement officers you'd have to hire, the court system, the judges, et cetera, and of course the number of mistakes you can make
Yeah.
in separating
Yeah.
families,
Yeah.
maybe even American citizens. There have been
Yeah.
cases, right, being sent overseas. You could have a lot of really, side effects that people hadn't considered.
There would certainly be really significant side effects, and it's not easy to do. You then risk, I mean, we all want to go after the people who are profiting off the backs of the most vulnerable, wherever you sit in the political spectrum,
Mhm.
right? And you actually de-incentivize the reporting of that. You de-incentivize engagement with the police forces that exist in cities. You create a lot of mistrust between communities. I mean, it has a lot of follow-on effect in addition to the economic impact, right? So my view is that as much as possible, collectively, and not just in the United States, all over the world, we need to look at the way the system functions and figure out how to build something that actually meets the workforce needs of today.
And that's a lot of what you're doing at IOM, right? Is
Yeah.
trying to figure out what that
Yeah.
new world would look like,
Yeah.
and helping countries get there
Yeah.
potentially. What do you think is IOM's relationship going to be like with the Trump administration? How do you expect that to play out? Because there was a history in the first term.
Yeah. I mean, so we don't know exactly. The United States is a founding partner. It's a founding country of our organization. The United States traditionally has had a director general who's an American and is by far our biggest donor. And that, by the way, has existed throughout our entire history, including with the first Trump administration, where they were an important partner in the work that we did. And I think it's partly because, we first and foremost are in the field. We are working to support communities in need. We help to stabilize communities. So, if there's a disaster and people are forced to move, our first job, you step in, you provide the shelter, you help provide water or hygiene kits, whatever it is, it just helps stabilize the population. Stabilizing the population in the first instance helps to actually manage the movements, right? Because people are rational, they're rational beings.
Mm-hmm.
If they don't have a safe place to sleep at night, if they don't have water, they'll move. That's just reality, and that's been true throughout human civilization. So that's part of why I think IOM has played such a critical role. We're there very, very quickly. We are not bureaucratic. We don't spend lots of time thinking about, okay, what's the should we do this, should we do that? We just get out there, and we get out there really fast. And so that has been valuable no matter what administration.
That's an important message about not being bureaucratic, because as you know, there's a lot of people in Trump
Yeah.
world
Yeah.
who are anti-UN for different reasons.
Yeah.
But one of them is this idea that this is slow, it's inefficient, and there's talk that they're going to really slash UN funding. IOM could be a victim of that too. Like, what is your worry if that were to happen? Like, what are the real world consequences if you saw major reductions in funding from the US to the UN?
So we're a slightly different animal because most of our funding comes from projects, which means that we don't get from the United States, several $billion and they say, okay, spend it however you want. No, we get a donor says we need water systems built in South Sudan, and we go out and we do it, right? So all of the work we do, 97% of our work is funded that way.
Yeah.
So,
but even that work is under, if you look at Project 2025, as I'm sure you have.
No. So my point is, if you cut that funding,
Mm-hmm.
you're not cutting a bureaucracy, you're cutting direct services.
Yeah.
Right. So that's the worry, right? There are more people on the move today than ever before. There are more people who are displaced, whether it's conflict or violence or disasters, etc. If you cut that funding, then it's the phenomenon we just talked about. People can't stay at home. They can't stay in the country or in the neighboring country. They will look for opportunities for safety because that's what human beings do.
Everybody would do it if they had to, right?
Right. So really, my view, if the president, as he says, wants to manage migration, doesn't want millions of people coming up to the border, having a strategy to provide support to people who are most in need wherever they are is the number one thing you do.
Yeah. Now, I make a prediction article every year, which is a very scary thing to do, because then people like yourself read it And who knows if I'm going to get these things right, but one of my top predictions is that we have reached peak official development assistance.
Yeah.
That if you look at the
Yeah.
politics, we talk about the U.S.,
Yeah,
but you
yeah,
can talk
yeah,
about
yeah.
Germany, France,
Yeah,
the
yeah,
UK.
100%.
So if ODA is going down, and given the vital work that IOM does, how do we change the model to get that
Oh
work
my
done,
goodness.
get it done at a bigger scale, but with less official money flowing
Yeah,
through
but
the
we
system?
have to change that model. So this is why I believe so much in migration, right? Because migration is one of the ways that you can actually enable people to be a force in their own development and the development of the country they've come from. So we see it across the world. The World Bank did this report in 2023. They show that migration across the board led to better development outcomes for the person, for the country she came from, the country she went to, right? And so, what I'd like to see, and I've argued this in my writing and other engagements, is that we actually need to invest in people, in the training and the opportunities that allow them to either deliver on the jobs for the future at home or get the skills and the training by getting jobs of the future elsewhere, right? And then we know they will put money back in the community they come from. You look at communities like Kerala in the state of India, where you had a lot of out-migration in the 70s, their development moved faster than other parts of the country.
That's where my family is from, so I can tell
There
you
you
I know
go.
that. And you can see a lot of, relatively modest structures
Yeah,
where people lived, very low-income people, and then a few years later, there's a second floor built on it, and then a third floor. Some of these you
exactly.
wonder if they're going to topple over because
Yeah,
so much money has been sent back,
but
right?
it's true. It's true. And you see, I mean, what I'm excited about are some of the partnerships we've had with the government. We have a government funder, we have a private sector funder, and we get the community involved in building out a diaspora investment chain.
Yep.
So then they are actually, and we have this great example in Somalia that we're now working on in other parts of the world, where we have a Somali community design what is their most important intervention. We help them build their diaspora engagement platform, and then we say, okay, we'll match the money that's coming in with donor money, right? So then they're bought into what we're doing. The diaspora is feeding into it, and then we can help support that. So
Yeah.
I think that kind of model, or we work with companies, it's the private sector that benefits when migration works. It's the private sector that needs the sustainable workforce, right? So we work with private sector companies to hire migrants, or we work with them to train people in the places where they want to build new manufacturing.
Yeah.
So you start to build this in this private partnership engagement, private sector, public sector, working together on particular development outcomes that actually empower the people who are it's meant to benefit. And not by just like building their houses for them, but by making them giving them the tools they need to compete in the century, the 21st century workforce.
Yep. Yeah, we were both just with Hamdullah Kaya not long ago, right? Of
Yes.
Chobani. He's a great
Yeah.
example of private sector, benefiting from helping, in his case, refugees or his employees at Chobani. Yeah, it's a big way. It's a new way of thinking of it.
Yes.
And it's refreshing to talk to you because, most of the narrative now in migration is really negative.
Yeah.
And it seems like we need a new mental model around
Yes.
it, which is to see migration for what it is, which is a potentially transformative thing
Yeah.
in a really positive way
Yeah.
for the world. And most of us come through some form of migration, right? Our family
Yes.
stories connect in some way. And we tend to think of that pretty positively. But right now, the narrative is not that, not at all.
It's not that because we haven't built the systems, right? So as long as countries do not have a pathway for someone to come in legally, and we rely entirely on border management, and we fail to address the needs of communities at the places they're coming from, and we fail to connect development work to the communities where people are coming from, we'll continue to see this backlash against migration because it goes back to this first point. When people are coming irregularly, it undermines the system. People don't have confidence in the system. And I know in the United States, for example, there's like a 20-year backlog if you're a Filipino who wants to come in through a regular channel. And then you see somebody come up through the border and just walk in, and you think, why am I waiting 20 years,
Yeah.
right? So if we want people to do what's right and work through the channels that exist, those channels need to work, right? And then we need to build down all the way to where people are coming from. But it doesn't mean, because I hear this sometimes, it doesn't mean everybody is going to come to the US. Because, by the way, the United States is not the only economy that's growing. If you look just
Sure.
in the Americas, Mexico had labor shortages, Brazil, Colombia, Uruguay has a rapidly aging population, Barbados has migration
Hmm.
needs. All across the Americas, there are huge migration needs. So maybe let's stop talking about just migration pathways into the US and start investing in how do we make it work in the Americas. Or you look in Africa, I just spent some time in Botswana and Zimbabwe, South Africa. They have opportunities that are existing. I was just in Cote d'Ivoire and Senegal, where they have new oil reserves. They're looking at how do you build that out? Who's the workforce that works there?
Hmm.
Let's think about that from the migration point of view. How do we build pathways for people to move within these various economic communities that now exist already within the continent, and then make that part of the work we're doing?
It's a much bigger and more positive vision. So I love hearing that from you. It's such a thrill to get to spend some time with you here at
It's great
Davos.
to be here. Yeah, it's fantastic. And you can see why I'm here, right?
Yeah,
We have all the players, we have new ideas. It's a way to drive some action.
it absolutely is. Thank you so much. Great to
Thank
be
you.
with you,
Yeah,
Amy.
pleasure.